Hello and welcome to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. I'm John Negroni, a published fantasy author with over 10 years of experience as a professional writer and editor. And today we are going to take a look at, I believe it is a Reddit post from the Fantasy Writers subreddit. So we don't have a listener prompt today, but if you would like to write in your own advice, we love taking those as well. Our email is fantasywritingforbarbarians@gmail.com. You can find in the show notes or join the Discord, hang out with other fellow barbarian writers there. We've been getting a few more lately, which has been really fun. And so, yeah, we're just going to look at, and I haven't looked at it yet, by the way, as usual, our wonderful producer, Natalia Emmons, has sent this along and look at it for the first time. And I think that lately we've been covering some really specific stuff. So I'm hoping this one is also going to be a nice, maybe, break from the pace, a little bit different. So let's look at it. Okay, so I'm going to bring it up right here. All right, so, okay, this comes to us from username Alexis Nobre. And the headline is Mythopia, the creation of myths. Interesting, okay. Hello, everyone. My name's Lexi, and at the moment, I'm on my last semester of a creative writing course. I'm currently working on my thesis, which consists of the study of Mythopia, or the creation of myths. I'd like to know from all the fantasy writers out there, did you create a myth for your current work in progress? Did you use an existing mythology, such as Greek mythology, Norse mythology, etc.? Or does your novel not focus on the mythology aspects of your world? Does your world have one single mythology, or does it have various? And most of all, I'd like to know what compelled you to create your own mythology for your novel. Thanks in advance for everyone who answers. Awesome. So this is different. So this is not somebody asking for advice. This is very much somebody who is working on something or researching something and is gauging a lot of fantasy writers. So I'm sure we're going to have some cool stuff in the comments, which I'm excited to dig into if we have the time. But of course, I can dig into this as well. And I can also, because this is an advice kind of program, I can also kind of explain maybe how you can create your own mythologies, if that's something that you're interested in, for those of you listening who might be curious. But yeah, let's answer the question, of course. I guess that is what I should do. So we got a few questions in here. Did you create a mythology for your world? And which I'll say, yes, I've created mythologies for different books. Did you use a real world myth like Norse or Greek? I have also done that as well, but not Norse or Greek. I've used Taino-Caribbean. Does your world not need mythology at all? I don't know if I've ever written a fantasy novel that doesn't have some kind of mythology, even if it is in the background. So that's the quick answer. And if you did create one, why? I mean, why not? Creating mythologies is kind of fun, but this is a Pandora's box of questions, and I like it a lot. So I'm ready to dig into it. Let's answer though a preliminary question, because there might be some of you who, maybe there's an obvious question out there you might be curious about. Why are we in the fantasy space, writers and readers, why are we so obsessed with mythology in the first place? Right? I think that that's a pretty fair question. It's something I've thought about before. And, here's the deal to me. I think that myths and how you can use myths in a fantasy world, they can be like the soul of the world that you're creating. They can be the symbolic operating system, if I can use a technology metaphor, a symbolic operating system that really tells a society, the people in the society you're creating, who they are and where they came from, that explains their origins, why things in their world are the way that they are. And in real life, mythology is how ancient cultures would explain things that they couldn't yet prove, right? Why does the sun rise? Well, obviously, because a flaming god hauled it across the sky in some kind of chariot. Why do the seasons change? Well, it's because Persephone, Persephone's in a toxic situationship, isn't she? With the death god. So yeah, we've been doing this for a long time, human beings. In fantasy, though, mythology is a way where you can actually ground the unreal while still keeping it fantasy. It's grounding something without losing what makes it fantastical, if that makes sense. It makes your made-up world feel like an old world, a world that is worn, that feels lived in. And it can give your world a lot of texture, too, a lot of specificity and details and mystery and intrigue. It can give it depth and history. Because to me, like a fantasy world without myths, yes, it can work, but it's hard to do because I think that like it's almost like having a world without a culture, or a world that's just kind of there. And obviously you can do stuff like that in sci-fi, because then you're reframing the novel and the world and all that. But even sci-fi has its own mythologies, especially when you go to other places in the universe. And sure, the mythology isn't going to be a bunch of Greek and Norse stuff, but it's going to still have things that are kind of fantastical, unexplainable, urban legends, things of those in nature. So for that reason, I think that mythologies and fantasy, they go all the way back. They obviously go as far back as Tolkien, one of the grandfathers of modern fantasy writing. And the real poster child Tolkien was, because he didn't just invent elves. He wrote Elvish, and he gave them songs and legends and creation myths. He gave them an entire cosmology, all 9 of the Silmarillions. And because of that, of all that texture, Middle Earth, it doesn't, at least to me, feel like just kind of a maybe throwaway fantasy world that people forget about. People research this stuff. People know Middle Earth super, super well. It feels real. It feels almost kind of sacred in its own way. And yes, I am choosing to talk about Lord of the Rings because I very much embarrassed myself last week when I couldn't remember Arwen's name, or that Kate Blanchett's name in the movies she's been in. That was embarrassing as heck. Of course, I had to bring it back to Tolkien to, I guess, not redeem myself. That's impossible. But anyway, let's move on to the actual substance of the question, though. So when you're building a mythology into your story, you're trying to do it yourself. I would say that there are at least 3 approaches that I like, not just as a writer, but as a reader myself. They all kind of come with their own perks, their own pitfalls, so we can break it down a little bit. I'd say that the first option is to invent your own myth from scratch. This is what Tolkien did, right? If you're, Brandon Sanderson, he's done very similar things. You can create an entirely new mythology within your fantasy world, totally original and all of that. You can decide your creation myths, how they work. You can develop your pantheon of gods. You can create a whole underworld. You can create your own flood story if you want to, demons or saints or star signs. You can do all kinds of stuff like that. And the pros of doing something like that is that you have total control, right? You can weave all this stuff perfectly into your plot and your theme, your character arc. You don't have to do a ton of research into stuff that already exists or worry about authenticity and credibility because it's your mythology, right? And you can also make it more thematically potent, maybe than it otherwise would be. So, because when you do it right, your myth can actually become the story itself, like the hero with 1,000 faces. And you also get to explore what your fantasy society believes and why. So yeah, you have a lot of wiggle room, and there's a reason why this is probably the more common approach for most writers. They typically just make up their own mythology. So the cons of this, though, is that it is really hard. It is a lot of work to just invent an entire belief system, which is really what you're doing. It's very easy to lose the thread, to get disorganized with it. You can end up writing just pages and pages, 40 pages or something of religious history that no one either is going to read or actually wants to read. You can kind of lose yourself with it. So my tip for that would be, keep the mythology itself symbolic, not encyclopedic. That tends to be an issue. There's a reason why a lot of the mythology in Lord of the Rings is in the appendix. And you can also just remind yourself to use the mythology you're creating to create meaning. Meaning is what all this stuff really comes down to. It shouldn't just exist to exist. There should be a meaning behind it, an intention, a feeling behind it that actually resonates with people. And so you can ask what, for example, the myth itself teaches its people. What's the moral of the story, right? With a mythology that you are creating. What kind of fear or hope or something else does this mythology encode? That's also super important. And you can make sure too that your characters are always interacting with the mythology emotionally. Whether they believe in the mythology or they question it, if they suffer because of it. Great example would be Sazed from the Mistborn trilogy. One of the big things with his character arc is coming to grips with all of these religions that he's been trying to protect and save and losing faith, and that was such a great kind of like arc for him to really hone in on like what mythology means to this character who should believe, in the most fantastical stuff. Now, all that said, I think that there is a second approach that is almost just as common as option 1. There's actually kind of like some middle ground here in the sense that people will create entire mythologies, but a lot of the time they're still basing that mythology either loosely or not that loosely off of existing stuff. So the second main approach that you can take is actually remixing your your mythology, your new mythology with real world mythology. So it's kind of like the middle ground approach. This is like what R.F. Kuang does with the Poppy War. So, or Babel too, I think to an extent. So R.F. Kuang pulls heavily from Chinese mythology and history and linguistics and things like that. She doesn't actually copy and paste the mythologies. She actually just puts her own spin on it. In some ways, she sort of translates it for a modern audience. She filters it through a totally different lens, a second world, because it's not the real world that the Poppy War takes place in. I'm not talking about Babel in that instance, of course. And she lets the myth actually reshape the politics of the world she's created, the culture of it, the conflict. This is actually how I approach mythopia, creating myths in my own work too. So I've drawn heavily from Taino and Caribbean mythologies. I never treat them like a one-to-one where I am just like going very literal with these are the mythologies from Taino and Caribbean. No, I spent years and years studying this stuff, and I have multiple textbooks. I have a book around here somewhere. I think I showed it on the podcast before, but I go through textbooks, primary sources, real traditions, oral traditions, YouTube channels that specialize in this sort of thing. And I studied all of it until I could fully understand for myself what these stories actually mean to the people who believe them, and how I could faithfully and tastefully translate them into my own fantasy stories, because I put my own twist on it. I make sure that whatever I invent preserves the spiritual feeling, the spiritual truth behind the original stuff. And that means honoring the tone, the symbolism, and the values underneath that mythology, even if I remix the details. So, for example, a lot of Taino mythology has a lot to do with preservation and peace and respecting the environment. What would be inauthentic and not tasteful for me is if I remix that into a story that was colonialist, or that celebrated consumption, that celebrated trashing the environment. So you see what I'm saying? It's like something that kind of violates the very principles of that mythology for a story that's just kind of like, totally antithesis to what that mythology is trying to say. So that's the basic gist of it. And even in less harmful ways, if your mythology, you're just using mythology as a reason to make all your characters super Jedi wizards, and it's a mythology that's about peace, and I shouldn't say Jedi, I guess, in that sense, because Jedi are supposed to be about peace too, I guess. But you know what I'm saying? If you're just kind of like doing it as an excuse to do your own kind of like school of wizards, and the whole thing is like we got to beat the bad guy and be super strong and violence and all that, and the mythology itself is not about that, that can be a bad thing, right? Now that said, you can also, if you want to next level this, I like to lean into that and lean into like the peacefulness of the mythology, and how the main character doesn't believe in that. The main character has that as a flaw, that this mythology they don't engage with truthfully, and that they are maybe a violent person. I like that as well, because that can generate some actual conflict, and you can make that part of the character's journey. So that's certainly a valid way to approach it too, in my opinion. And so, yeah, I'd say that pros for this option, if you want to remix mythologies, the main pro is that you have those rich cultural roots, and that's going to instantly resonate with a lot of people. Even if they're not familiar with that mythology, they're just going to feel the realness of it. And so it's a lot less pressure on yourself to create that resonance by yourself. And the other pro I'd say is that you get to participate in this living tradition of storytelling. You get to participate in bringing that mythology, especially if it's an underrepresented mythology, to other people. Now, that's assuming that you genuinely love the mythology itself. Even better if you're part of that mythology's like indigenous tradition. So for me, I go back, yes, Taino, Puerto Rican, and all of that. A mix of things, of course, because the whole history of Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. But that said, when you are able to go into this with like some kind of, let's say, intention, where for me that intention is I love Taino mythology, Caribbean mythology in general. It's really cool. And I love the idea that I get to write stories that can maybe spread some of these tales to people who've never heard them before. And by remixing them, I make them a bit more accessible while still preserving their authenticity, so that people can read the stories themselves and get a lot out of it. So this is very similar to what I did for the fairy tale that I put in the fairy tale magazine, which is called, it's a twist on Sleeping Beauty, but instead of kind of European folklore, I use Puerto Rican Taino folklore. So in that short story / fairy tale, I'm using a lot of things that people might not be as familiar with mythologically, but it is still something that people will get a lot out of, because it's sort of like, oh yeah, this is a taste of what this mythology means. And you get to learn it in a fun way without it feeling like homework, I guess. Hopefully. I guess then the cons to this, I've already kind of touched on them a little bit, is that you really have to do your research. So the pressure is off in terms of like, oh yeah, you don't have to create all the nuts and bolts necessarily. But then the risk of messing this up is way higher, because then you risk offending a lot of people. You risk looking very bad, like you looking kind of amateurish and turning people off to your story very, very quickly. People will probably be more forgiving if you mess up your own mythology, but if you mess up somebody else's, that can create a lot of, tension. And even if you're doing this with like Greek mythology, which is widely understood, people can be very nitpicky about these sorts of things. They can be like, you just don't get it. It's a lot harder. It's a lot harder to do in terms of if you haven't done the work, I guess, essentially. So yeah, and also, I mean, you need to approach this stuff with respect, right? You have to, especially if it's tied up again in like indigenous and still practiced religions, because it can be really touchy and it can definitely hinder the success of whatever story you're trying to write. A lot of people just might not give it a chance because there's so much bad press around it, or they start reading it and they're like, oh, this is totally offensive, whatever it is, right? So yeah, very difficult. But I would say a quick tip for that is just learn enough to break the rules without breaking the soul of the story. That's simple, right? And I mean, that's simple, but it takes a lot of work. But I think overall, you have to honor the myth's real meaning, and you can't just extract the aesthetics of the myth. I see this all the time with Greek stories, or even like angels and demon stories, or it's just like people sort of taking, again, the aesthetics of these ideas, like vampires. This happens a lot too. It's just aesthetic. It's not really deep or meaningful. It's kind of like a shortcut. And when you try to dig into it, it's like, this is kind of surface level. Like there's nothing really here to sink my teeth into. Vampire pun sort of intended. But okay, third option. So this is a recap. First option would be create your own myth. Second option would be remix the myth structure. So a little bit of the real stuff, a little bit of your own thing. And then the third one would be just using the real world myth, but with very minimal changes. So I guess you could probably do like Rick Riordan in this, like Percy Jackson. It's a spectrum, but like the gods in that are the gods, right? They're not invented Greek gods. They've just, they're in New York, whatever it is. And you can also do a kind of Neil Gaiman thing, although I hate bringing up Neil Gaiman these days. Look it up. But he kind of did this with the Norse gods in American Gods. He did there's a lot of stuff in American Gods, right? And sometimes what people try to do is they try to make the fantasy world our world. They use like real religious stuff, real mythologies, and then they make it into a magical realism. So we see this a lot in all kinds of, so I think a Song of Achilles, I guess you could qualify as this, but it's a story that is sort of leaning into like you already have some kind of understanding of the real mythology, and this is kind of a twist on it, but it's not necessarily making up as much stuff as option 2, which would be kind of like a hybrid approach. And at the same time, we don't see this super, super often. We usually see something kind of in between options 2 and 3, or kind of like a variation where sometimes people will make a totally new mythology that clearly feels heavily inspired by an existing one, but they change the names and stuff. To the other side of that spectrum is, yes, it's the same kind of mythology, but it has a few little tweaks, right? Obviously, Percy Jackson is not, super faithful to all the rules of Greek mythology, but it does play into the real stuff. It accepts that the real stuff is true. That's the whole point. But then all the changes and tweaks are just based on misunderstandings and things along those lines. Hopefully that makes sense. It's a little bit tricky to explain, I guess. But I'd say for sure the pros of an approach like option 3 is that you have the built-in familiarity. You don't need to world build as much. People know this stuff already. Like readers will recognize Odin or Hades, Shiva, whatever it is. Like people kind of already know of this stuff. So it's a little bit easier to create intrigue and to create interest without people being like, who's that? What? Huh? What? I don't know where we are, and that kind of thing. And also you can use option 3 in a way to really create some interesting subversion, telling existing myths, but from a different perspective. So what are these gods like now? Right? Like what if you told the Greek myth, but from the perspective of Hades as the main character, and actually he's good, he's just misunderstood, like stuff like that, where you can, again, you have the built-in familiarities, people know the characters, but what's hooky about the story, what hooks them into the story, is that it's a different perspective though. It's like a different take on this that I'm actually kind of interested, because I've never really thought of it that way. So that's a huge pro for a lot of stories that dig into this kind of thing. I'd say that the cons of stuff like option 3 is that you are limited by what the readers already know. And so that means if you don't bring something new to the table, then it can feel a little bit like fan fiction. Not to, diminish fan fiction, of course, it has its place, but fan fiction can be enjoyed. It just needs to be enjoyed in the right context. A lot of the time it's not enjoyed if it's trying to be passed off as something that it's not. And in this case, you definitely ride a thin line there in making it feel like your own thing with an authorial voice rather than playing in somebody else's sandbox and trying to pass it off as your own thing with very minimal stuff. Another con too would be if you're trying to basically be like, oh, this is a fairy tale retelling. But when it comes down to it, it's like it's not really a retelling. It's just like maybe some similar names to the characters and some sort of similar plot beats, but the spirit of the fairy tale is not in there. I could mention one book in particular, but it was written by somebody who also does stuff like this on YouTube. So I think it would be a little tacky if I named them. But there is somebody who wrote a book that was kind of like that. They marketed it as like, this is a fairy tale retelling of like two different fairy tales. And then when you actually read the book, it's like, that feels like marketing. Like it doesn't really feel like these fairy tales remixed. It just feels like you wrote this story and you can maybe vaguely compare them to these fairy tales, but there's not really these fairy tales. So yeah, I'd say then if you're in this kind of, approach, if this is the approach that you want to do, just make sure you know why that specific mythology, why this one over your own or any other mythology, right? Don't just include a god in the story because they sound cool, you like the name of them, and you read like a Wikipedia description. Actually dig into like what's interesting about them, what makes this god kind of human-like, whatever it means. And you can also examine like what part of the myth speaks to the themes of your story, right? It should still have that alignment where this mythology, if you take the Greek gods again, it's sort of about the hubris, the pride of human beings and how they try to be like the gods or how the gods manipulate them and don't care about humans. So if you write a story that just doesn't really engage with any of that meaningfully or even try to subvert it, then it just sort of feels again like an aesthetic. It's just like they're Greek gods and they're here, whatever. This happens in comic books a lot, where comic books will be like, this superhero is from this mythology. There's really nothing about that character that has anything to do with the mythology. It's just they're there. I guess you could even make this argument that it happens with some good comic book storylines, but you have to sort of overlook it. I've always kind of felt this way with like Norse mythology. I've felt like the way that Marvel has handled Thor, at least in the modern era, just doesn't quite fit. But I guess they get away with it because it is the context of a superhero story and it is pretty surface level and people tend to be pretty forgiving. But I guess there's a reason why the best Thor movie is the one where it's Thor Ragnarok, which it leans into the Norse stuff, but it subverts it a lot. It makes it a comedy. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It doesn't try to like, hand wring everything. So anyway, that's a whole other tangent, I guess. But okay, there was another question in this. Yeah. Okay, so Alexi wanted to know why create your own mythology at all, which is a great question. And I think the answer is going to be different for everyone, really. I think that for some people, it's about the depth of the world. For other people's, it's the theme. And, I think that what I mean is that creating your own mythology, it's going to give you an opportunity to, again, have that control, make it deeper, and not be totally beholden to rules that aren't yours. For other people, I would say because they want to create a mythology that really matches the theme they're going for. For me, it's identity. I think that a good myth doesn't just explain your world to people, it tells you who belongs in it. The contrast between the mythology and its people is the most important thing to me as a writer. That's what I find the most interesting. That's the niche that I find myself in. I think you can tackle that from all kinds of directions. Like, who doesn't belong in your world based on the mythology that exists, right? Who had to sacrifice to get ahead? Who lied in this world? Who remembers what happened in this world? Myths ultimately are about memory and passing those memories on. And fantasy is about transforming memory into meaning. I think if you want to be overly philosophical about it. But to me, that's why if you create like a fake religion, or you have your own fake, strange cosmology, whatever it is, or cosmogony is the word I'm thinking of. For example, like if you want to twist the flood myth into your own thing, it all has to matter. And it's like, matter? What do you mean by matter? Matter to the characters, right? The mythology needs to be there. It needs to be something that every character has a different response to, but a response that syncs with their personalities and the world that they live in. It all has to connect. If it doesn't, it just, again, it feels like you're telling your reader that, oh yeah, this mythology is here, but it doesn't matter. And the protagonist, the villain, they could swip ideologies and it wouldn't shift the story. That would be a huge problem if that was the case, right? And I would say that, mythologies need to answer, like, who are these people? Why do they bleed? Why are they in conflict? So yeah, I'd say anyone who's working on any kind of creation myth creating their own myth, creation myth, I'd say that, yeah, really make sure that you're not just building backstory and lore that's kind of interchangeable or throwaway. Make sure that you're writing a belief system, not just a magic or world system. It needs to be a belief system. You can make it do all kinds of things that you want. You can make it feel ancient. You can make it feel intriguing and sacred and mysterious, and we don't know all the answers. It can feel like a puzzle, whatever you want to do. But above all, make it yours. Even if it's one that you are taking whole cloth from option 3, which is, just kind of taking real world stuff, you can still make it yours. But if you're creating your own thing, then the onus is really on you to make it yours, because you got nothing else at that point. So, all right, there were some comments on this. I've run out of time though. I'm going to have a link, of course, to the Reddit post. So if any of you are interested and you want to read it, I'm just kind of seeing quickly. A lot of people are writing about myths and records and how they did their own thing. Very interesting stuff. I'm sure that you could check it out and get something out of it too. But for now, thank you so much for watching or listening to Fantasy Writing for Barbarians. And be sure, of course, to subscribe, whether you're a YouTube watcher or you listen on the podcast. You can subscribe, you can do whatever you want. And we'll be back for the next one. So be sure to keep on writing if that's what you feel like doing.